Hello and welcome back to Talking Insights, the podcast series from Esomar. I'm your host, Shrika Govindaraju, and throughout this series we're taking a closer look at the key topics of today, taking a step beyond the world of research and insights to tackle the big questions of our time. Our sector deals with understanding and predicting the world that we live in, so let's look beyond the numbers and dive into the most important conversations of today that will shape our tomorrow. As 2020 progresses, the world is not only facing a reckoning with regards to COVID-19, but also with the relationship between people of different races within our societies. Across the globe, minority voices are making themselves heard, taking a stand against entrenched and systematic racism and oppression, and fighting to make a change for the next generation. The movement has spread from the grassroots to the C-suites of the world. And like many other sectors, the market research sector too needs to contend with its attitudes towards race, diversity, and inclusivity. How does the research sector accurately reflect diverse populations, both with its research and its researchers? What changes are needed to make sure that research truly reflects social reality? And how are the next generation of young researchers embracing their diversity as their strength? Joining me in conversation today is Whitney Dunlap-Fowler, an independent brand strategist specializing in building culturally intelligent brands through cultural insights, semiotics, and market research. Whitney co-led the cultural insights practice at Kelton Global, where she used her knowledge and expertise to aid in deepening the company's brand strategy engagement, and owned her brand strategy roots during her time at Kantar Added Value, where she excelled in dual strategic roles across the brand and cultural insights teams while earning a master's degree in media, culture, and communications at NYU. Before leaving the company, she took on an additional role as the multicultural practice lead for North America and started an initiative called Insights in Color for minority professionals seeking to connect with others in the research community, an initiative she has recently started pursuing again, and which is well worth checking out. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I just listed, a very summarized version, I think, of your accomplishments in your time in the market research industry. Why don't you tell us, first of all, in your own words, what your experience has been working, especially as a Black woman, within the market research sector, and what ultimately persuaded you to start your own firm, Touch of Wit?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I, like many of my peers in this space, kind of fell into it. If you speak to enough researchers in general, you'll hear the same narrative that they didn't recognize or realize that this was an industry to even be a part of. And I fell into it like many of them did because of that, because it's usually not on the radars of consumers or people. It's definitely not on the radars of people of color. So I ended up mostly being the only Black person in my space for probably 6 years in my first company in this space. And I kind of just got used to it. Not only was I the only African American woman, I was the only American woman. I was in a British company.
Oh, okay. So my people.
Yeah, exactly. Which, I describe my experiences as pretty, I loved it there. The people that work there, they're still my friends. We have meetings, we're in group chats and everything. That's definitely my family. And I came from a space where I went to a predominantly white college and institution. So it wasn't a space that was unfamiliar to me, but it was a space that definitely was lacking. More people who looked like me, more people who had my background. I took with that experience what I could, and like you listed, I ended up becoming the multicultural lead for North America in one of my roles, and that was kind of, I guess, my way to kind of fight against some of that. But even moving into my next role, actually, it was a little bit more diverse, but I was more of the only one of the only people of color in a more senior held position, where other people of color were in more junior roles and tended to move along the industry, potentially even leaving the space. So being a Black woman in this category and being a Black researcher, it can be a very lonely journey. And you kind of find friends where you can, for sure.
And so moving off that, do you think the research sector today, based on your own experience, based on the work you're doing now independently, does it accurately reflect the world and our society as it is? Do you think there's enough people from minority backgrounds, Black women or other people of color within the research sector to truly reflect the reality of what we're researching, really?
Yeah, absolutely not. And I think that we're figuring that out today. I've been contacted by a number of brands and companies looking for, quite honestly, Black research firms, and
Hmm.
they're just things that don't really exist. There is a particular cadence of events that happens in our industry. I'm going to focus on women because it tends to be a female-led space.
Yeah.
Um, where Black women will enter the space, we'll learn our everything we need to learn about the client world and how to navigate those things, and then we kind of decide, actually, you know what, I'll be better off as a freelancer, and many of us leave the category.
Mm.
And what that's caused is a kind of a brain drain from our research space. We are sorely lacking for mentorship in our space and to bring in the next generation. Something that I'm hoping to change with Insights in Color for sure. But that's also caused clients to not really know where we are, or they don't really know how to find us. So there is a need to both create awareness, but also to collectively pull us all into the same place so that we can be accessed a little bit more readily. But as far as the market
Hmm.
research industry is concerned and how reflective it is of the actual population, that's definitely not the case. It is still predominantly white led,
Yeah.
and it's something that needs to change for sure.
I think that's quite similar to a lot about what you'd consider to be professional occupations as well, whether it might be finance, whether it might be the legal world. I think one of the issues that has been laid bare over the past few months is the real lack, as you say, of minority voices, women in particular, within these industries, within these positions, especially leadership positions, where they can affect more change in the company as a whole. But coming back to the research space, quality of research is obviously something that's very important and accurately reflecting, your samples, the market that you're trying to research. What do you see as some of the negative outcomes of research that doesn't accurately take into account, cultural and racial differences? Whether it's the samples themselves or also the researchers who are interpreting the data that they receive. How can this,
Yeah.
negatively impact the research that's carried out?
Yeah, I'm of the mind that, listen, the market research industry was built around, quite honestly, white men, white working class men.
Yeah.
When it first kind of got discovered and
Hmm.
people started understanding consumer behavior, that eventually switched to women of the household. So as we learned that women were the ones who had the purse strings, and we decided what was going to be purchased and brought into our
Mm.
homes. But let's be clear, it was white women. So the industry has been built across a particular narrative, which we like to call mainstream.
Yeah.
And it's from that narrative that we determine what is normative and what is basically a valued experience. Because of that, because we have a singular narrative from which to pull from, a lot of times minority work or work that has particular ethnic nuances gets thrown out the door. It's
Mm.
perceived as niche. It's perceived as too specific and not applicable to mainstream needs or consumer behaviors. I
Yeah.
think that might have been true when market research first started years ago.
Mhm.
When the population was majority white. We know today that the mainstream is quite multi-layered,
Yeah,
complex,
absolutely, yeah.
existing a lot of different ethnicities and identities that people are more so willing to claim than ever before. And so what's happening is how marketers are pursuing this mainstream narrative, it's basically we're lacking the other stories that can bring richer nuance and
Mhm.
new areas of opportunity for brands to really tap in on. So essentially, the problem is our stories aren't being told.
Yeah.
And if they are being told, they're not being told by us, and they're not being told in an authentic lens. They're not being
Mhm.
told with the full cultural context or historicity attached to those stories. A lot of times, things that happen in communities of color are associated with trends. Like we tend to get things, kind of in the cultural conversation, if you will.
Yeah.
And so we find that marketers and brands will tap into things that are happening in particular spaces because Black and Brown communities made them cool, but
Mm.
they don't. What tends to happen is the historicity is erased from behind those moments and what made those moments relevant in the first place. And so we're kind of used as an accessory, if you will. So
Yeah.
the problem is we need more people like ourselves to be the architects of this research
Mhm.
to make sure that it's not biased to only tell an antiquated mainstream story. and to make sure that it's building in the experiences that have been overlooked for decades now.
Well, I want to. There's a lot of really interesting points that you raised there. Not to mention some of the cultural research, which I do want to talk about some of your research projects and research areas a bit later on. But just sticking with what you mentioned there in terms of brands and messaging. Recently in one of Esomar's community circles, there was a comment from another researcher, another Black woman who's based in the US, saying a lot of brands were coming to her to message test nowadays. So it wasn't so much carrying out cohesive research, but more in terms of we have a message that we want to put out in light of the current social, political climate, and we want you to test how accurate this is. Do you see that as a real issue that's going forwards? Because you have a lot of brands who will, in a way, it's almost a show, right? It's almost like when we talk about greenwashing when it comes to the environmental space. Are we seeing a similar problem now when it comes to racial sensitivity, racial diversity, where it's a lot of talk and not enough action to back it up?
Yes. In my space, because I'm a cultural strategist, I've been bringing this conversation to my clients for years now. I've basically been saying, listen, consumers want to know what you stand for. They want to know your values. You don't have an option to sit out of this conversation, and you'd better do the work to figure out what you want to stand for in this space, or they're going to bring you into that conversation. Now, that wasn't happening as actively as it's happening today. And what we're finding is that clients are completely terrified of their consumer base because they have nothing to say. They haven't prepared for it.
Yeah.
And so the method for seeming more culturally relevant or seeming like they're inclusive or seeming like they're diverse is to do a looky-see to see what other brands are doing and kind of to co-opt those messages. It's kind of who's doing it well. We should do those things too, instead of doing the work to figure out how they could do it a bit differently. And what you tend to have, and what you're often seeing, is that the messaging, while well-meaning, it's really just to silence the critics. A lot of times, it's to position the company as being on top of the moment and being, well informed. It is just, again, it's a decoration. It is hey, everything is fine over here. And a lot of times, not all the time, but often, we find that companies are not willing to do the work beyond those messaging cues. And I would also argue that message testing should be happening across diverse audiences when there's also not racial conflict in America. Those perceptions should be gathered at all times. We should understand what a Black community versus a Latinx community versus an Asian, Latino, or whatever that might be community, even Native American might think of a particular idea, concept, image, or whatever that might be, even when a brand's back is not against the wall.
And it's fascinating in the context of, I'm speaking to you from Europe at the moment, where we like to think, society has kind of come together a bit more cohesively. But for a long time, speaking of the US was considered that standard bearer for the idea of a melting pot of cultures. In the US as a country, as you know, is entirely founded by immigration. It's entirely founded by people coming together from all different parts of the world. Why do you think it is that, in this day and age, despite knowing this and despite the history of the US as a country, with all the trials and tribulations along the way, how is it the market research sector hasn't fully tapped into this idea yet, where we shouldn't be just taking a subset of people as being emblematic of the whole country, but as you mentioned just then, look into all the different ethnic groups that make up the United States to really get an accurate image of what is going on. What do you think has been holding that back?
Our industry, like many other industries, it's a reflection of who's leading these spaces. And if you keep an industry white-led, if you keep an industry led by the dominant culture in a society, which in America it is white men or white colleagues and coworkers, what tends to happen in a dominant versus subordinate group dynamic is that the dominant group sets the rules and standards for a society. They don't really need to know or look down to see what's happening in those subgroups. And they don't need to necessarily concern themselves with them historically, Whereas the subgroups have to understand dominant culture because it's those norms that they have to ascribe to in order to be successful and to survive. So you have a dynamic where we know everything about dominant culture. We know how to code switch, how to be in those spaces. We've worked to manipulate ourselves and our experiences to be accepted in those spaces.
Yeah.
And you have a dominant culture that's never had to do that, never needed to do that. And until that changes on a leadership scale, until someone with a bigger footprint or bigger authority can come in and sit in those spaces to have those changes occur happens, then we're going to continue to see the same thing, the same types of narratives being told, the ones that are familiar to us. We are a society of familiarity. We like what we know, and we kind of stick with it. And anything that changes that dynamic too much feels like a headache. And in the brand world, if it changes too much, it feels like a risk, especially if your job is to champion a particular brand or product, and you may not feel like you have the authority to do that, especially if lots of ad spend is based on your strategic insights and input. I would argue that we are a risk-averse industry when it comes to the action points that come from strategies. I know for a fact that there are a lot of great strategies that come from the work that we do from research professionals, but at the end of the day, it's what brands do with that work. So it kind of sometimes falls into a vacuum, and it's going to fall into the vacuum of the people who own those brands and those projects who tend to be a part of dominant culture.
And I feel that possibly what leads to the issues I'm sure you've seen as well. We avoid brand names, but the infamous soft drink advert, which takes place during a protest, and angry police in the street, and then the protest is seemingly resolved when someone hands over a can of refreshing soft drink. I feel that's the kind of...
I know a bit of the backstory of that. I'm not going to divulge my sources, but situations like that, I think is very much it's very much look at this cultural moment. We should do something in this. And I think this is back when Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown had first, when their names had first appeared in the news. A brand said we should be, I guess the thinking was that the brand said we should be reflecting what's happening. And they did it without the context, the historicity. They did it without an additional lens to say, this is actually what's wrong with this. Even if to my knowledge, there was pushback internally. But at the end of the day, the people who pulled those strings were not a part of the culture that narrative spoke to, and they said yes to it.
And we saw how spectacularly that backfired, I suppose.
Exactly.
Well, I think this is where, as you said before, cultural strategy or cultural insights are vitally important. And you yourself, your description is as a cultural strategist. So can you give us just a brief description of what that means, as a role, and how does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the work that you carry out on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So, just as context, cultural insights, semiotics, etc. These are concepts that are definitely a lot more popular in the UK and in other countries. The United States tends to be a very data-based, facts-driven kind of economy. So, there's a bit of an arts to the science in cultural insights, and it's harder for clients to buy into that notion. But cultural strategy is essentially it's brand strategy. It's the overlooking the traditional qual and quant measures, but it's making sure to do that with the lens of culture added to that dynamic, and whether that's identifying macro trends in which those insights might sit in, identifying the cultural context for the audience members that we might be speaking to, or even the category we might be diving into. It's really about kind of filling in the gaps where the research doesn't always hit, and kind of saying the why behind the data. A lot of times clients believe that consumers can tell them everything in the full picture. And at the end of the day, they can't really identify the invisible influences that are being had on their purchase decisions, their perceptions of the world around them, and their behaviors. And it's really the job of someone like myself as a cultural strategist to say, well, actually, there are these larger things happening in the world. So that's probably why this individual bought this red shirt or went to this event or whatever that might be. And it's a better standpoint as far as research is concerned, because a lot of times what happens is clients will see a trend. This is very popular in the beauty space. They'll see a trend and say, oh, why didn't we do mud masks? Or why didn't we do this? How are we behind the times? And I'll say, well, I see this trend that you're speaking about. Let's talk about the bigger picture that it might be attached to. Because if clients adhere to or try to put themselves in the space of trends, what tends to happen is by the time product development is done and insights is done, the trend has kind of gone away.
Yeah.
So it's really my job to identify the larger territories that those trends are attached to so that we can predict future movement and future innovation for our clients.
And do you think part of the issue with, when we talk about these brands either making missteps or, not accurately reading the situation, is it because on the one hand, they're not employing or not listening to enough professionals in the research sector like yourself who have this specific focus on cultural strategy, on semiotics, as you mentioned? Or is the problem also with a lack of culturally diverse leadership at the top of these companies who are really driving the decision making? Do you think which should really come first, and what's the best way for these two sides to work together? For both brands to be more successful, and also for consumers to actually see their messages as sincere, or to see their efforts as actually trying to make an impact.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it's a bit of both, who makes up the strategy teams and who's leading the work. When you have a society, I'm going to go back to this dominant culture thing, because when you have a dominant culture, you don't think of your own culture as being a culture, which is kind of what's happened with white people in America for the longest time, because they were the mainstream and they were deemed as normative. They didn't always inspect themselves through the lens of other, if you will. But countries like the UK did, they said, what's American culture and what does that look like and what does that mean? And so sometimes you need to have someone who has that lens of being able to separate themselves from what feels quite obvious, to say, hey, can someone look into this thing that feels quite normative to me and maybe identify some key cultural contexts or things that I might be missing from this picture? But a lot of times you don't have strategists in senior roles to think that way, people who can separate themselves from the space of normative, everyday, mainstream narratives and lives. So they don't think to look into the culture unless it's about trends, of course. They don't think to look into culture in a particular way unless they might be going to a different country. So they'll be like, what's Chinese culture? What's that about? What's it like in France? What are French people like? You know what I mean? It's more of I'm the mainstream. Anything that's not like me is othered. And that's the only time in which I'll think of understanding the cultural context of that space. When in all actuality, cultural context needs to be understood at all times. And then the people who need to do it need to be great at doing that. There's a lot of, creating frameworks and storytelling to make sure that those stories are told correctly and that it's understood. So you definitely need a qualified cultural strategist to both paint the picture and give you the so what of it. A lot of what I do is a lot of information, and clients love that. But at the end of the day, they have to make decisions. So I'm able to also say, well, this is the so what of it. This is what it means for your category. This is what it means for your brand or your product innovation strategies.
And from kind of switching perspectives here, so that's in your day-to-day life, or in your job. Let's say if you're in the position of the consumer, what to you is kind of a giveaway that a company hasn't really thought about this deeper cultural context, that is instead just trying to broadcast a message to catch a particular moment in time, or just to look as if they're taking some kind of action? What to you are kind of the tells that there isn't a real effort going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, there are easy tells. I will say that the cultural climate of consumers today it's tricky. I'm not gonna lie. Like even I'm very careful of what I say about my own community, because I don't want to miss something. I don't want to misrepresent an idea or a concept. And it's very easy to get it wrong, specifically for African Americans. We are very sensitive. I think we're in a space where we're just like, all right, we're tired of this. We've been saying this for years, and you're going to get this right finally. So we're quite easily triggered, but also like social media has kind of created a bullying space where some of that manifests in some of the most negative ways. But I say that to say we are really, consumers are really in corporate the back rooms of corporate America. We're looking at Instagram feeds, we're looking at mission statements, we're looking at philanthropic causes, we're decoding it,
Hmm.
right? You said you did this thing, but your leadership, is accused of X, Y, and
Yeah.
Z. So there are a lot of layers. I would say the most superficial tells are definitely going to be what you're presenting on social media. If you've never had a Black
Hmm.
person speak about your
And all of a
brand,
sudden, someone
or
just pops up to.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Or if you never had a Latinx kind of representative or whatever that might be, we're going to be like, I don't really know if this is believable. But even beyond that, we're looking in the crevices to see where you're getting it wrong and right. And some of us, unfortunately for brands, are looking for where you're getting it
Mm.
wrong. Like that's our sole
Yeah.
jobs of saying, oh, you guys like this company, let me show you what they've done wrong. And there's like a whole white paper of things that they've ethically been wrong on. I will say this though, because brands are so afraid of activating in particular ways. I think something is better than nothing. And I think consumers have a forgivable and forgetful spirit, if I'm being
Yeah.
honest. If a brand can take the onus and kind of man up on things that might have been missteps for them and then continue to do things the right
Mhm.
way, there is time and opportunity to kind of change things that have gone wrong for that company. But I think that the key is to at least start. Ideally well informed, of course, than to not say or do anything at all.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, of course, here in Europe, we've had somewhat of a movement as well, but of course, it's much more pronounced in the US. And following news that's coming out of the US, you see things like certain brands, let's say, changing the name of a brand of syrup. I think was one of them that
Mhm.
came out, or even I think Uncle Ben's Rice was also brought up as a possibly controversial name. Do you see movements like this? Is that really meaningful change, or is that at the end of the day someone sat in the back room at the company in the kind of marketing and branding division saying, this is something that we can do to move with the times, or try and appease a section of our consumer base?
I'm not a fan of being a part of the change Olympics, meaning like which change is better than the other. There are a lot of and in the brand space, I think any forward movement is always great. Now, will it be compared to other movements and other things? Like that's an inevitable human spirit. That's what we do. We'll say, oh, this company, I believe it's Netflix, is investing in black
Yeah.
banks, and you're just changing a syrup bottle. I think
Yeah.
I think both are fine.
Mhm.
And not every brand has permission to play in particular ways. So I think both are fine. Honestly, the criticism here is more about systemic change that
Mhm.
needs to happen, things that are really life threatening issues. So, in the brand world, I'm a fan of changing anything, even if it seems quite minor. But on the grand scheme of things, when there are other policies, procedures, laws that need to change, it can feel quite
Mhm.
minuscule, but I think that it still needs to happen.
Well, on the note of systematic change, there, we're seeing, of course, on a political level, there's movements in terms of defund the police or to put more money in towards community initiatives. Do you think that the corporate world, and corporate America in particular, are they responding in kind? Have there been enough assurances or enough changes made to make sure that, as we mentioned before, this having this lack of black voices and representation, in higher up positions in companies, is there enough being done that this is going to change moving forward? So not just in corporate America, and also in the research sector in particular, are we seeing some change coming?
I think that there is an appetite for change. I also think that there is an appetite for somehow it miraculously happening
Hmm.
magically overnight without the
I
effort.
think everyone would like that,
um,
right?
yeah, 100%. And I can give a great example for Insights in Color, the initiative that I've started to make sure that more diversity is in the research sector. I've gotten a lot of feedback and a lot of congratulatory praise of saying this is much needed, but when it boils down to who can help me do the work, it's a bit of a different story, as it should be. I mean, everyone's quite busy, but there is. I think the change is going to happen, and I think that there's appetite for change within most industries. I've heard a lot of people talk about, my manager wants to do this. I've had brands come to me saying, we don't really know where to start. We've just always been white, and now we feel like that's wrong.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the appetite for change is there. There's a lot of not knowing where to start, which I'd say to brands, that's perfectly fine. At least you're trying to start and have those conversations. There's a lot of piecing together the DE&I ecosphere of what do we need? Is it training? Is it brand strategy? Is it looking at our internal or external collateral pieces and things like that? Is it a brand landscape analysis? It can take shape in many forms. And I think brands are just trying to get it right. So I will say that a lot of work is being done. What this is going to look like, how much it will stick, I don't know. I think we'll have to see in the years to come. I think also we're in a space of companies kind of copying other companies and just trying to do the work. But at the end of the day, dismantling race and racism and discrimination, it took 400 years to build up. So it's not going to be a one-day unconscious bias session. It's going to take a while. It's going to take multiple sessions. It's going to require measurement and progress tracking. It's going to require check-ins. It's going to require a detailed look at your hiring practices over and over and over again to see where the gaps are. So it's not a one-night solve. It requires work and consistent work. And when that foot is off the gas, what tends to happen is we go back to what we know and what is normative. And unless that drive for change is coming from leadership, then there will be no change.
And when you mentioned the metrics, or you're kind of tracking this progress over the coming years, okay, some things you can kind of track in a numerical values. Let's say if you're looking at the number of Black people in leadership positions within companies, within boardrooms, etc. How are you going to, or is there a way to track some of the more non-quantifiable metrics here? So if we're talking about cultural attitudes, let's say, in your work, do you have a way is there a way to quantify this? Is there even a way to sort of accurately measure change in that context?
I think there's a way to accurately measure anything you can imagine. I think there just has to be an awareness of what to track and measure, and a couple of ways to figure that out. And it's things like this, kind of finding those intangible factors. It requires a kind of trial and error process, right? I think the tech industry has been really good at identifying things on a numbers basis, but also being upfront with this is an evolving metric. We think we've captured everything, but we might be changing the way that we're thinking about this in the future. And that's okay as we kind of learn gaps and opportunity areas for getting this right. So everything is quantifiable. Everything is measurable. Some things need to be done with softer skills, such as interviews and understanding things that way. The research industry is specifically built for this. Okay. We are built for this, and we never research ourselves. We never research. We just kind of look at the world. I've been a part of a lot of projects where I'm telling a company how to do their D&I strategy. I'm telling a company how to get more multicultural consumers. I'm telling a company how to talk to more Latinx women or Black women and how they need to diversify their internal structure, just to return to a research company that's built for quantifying and measuring that has not done it on itself, which is a bit of it's kind of crazy.
So you feel there needs to be some this research of the research sector almost to find those pain points, find where things need to be adjusted.
Yes, so that's actually an initiative that I'm hoping to take charge of, to research some of the themes that we've noticed happening in our industry, to kind of call out why the numbers are what they are, and to create awareness, and then to create a new draw to our space. We are known as an old, antiquated space for old people and surveyors, but what we do is actually quite more dynamic and sexy and appealing. And I think people just need to know those things.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because when we so before recording this podcast, we had a brief conversation just to kind of get to know each other. And one of the things I mentioned is, coming to the research sector as an outsider, my initial impression was, it's almost when you're walking to the train station and someone approaches you with a clipboard and says, "Oh, do you have a few minutes to talk about, X and Y issue? Or can you tell me your feelings on X and Y products?" Or someone hands you a sample of yogurt. And then it's only after coming into this world that you see, as you mentioned, then there's a lot of really intelligent, scientifically based work that's going on. But I do want to touch on one particular point. So we recently spoke to an AI researcher based in Amsterdam. And one of the issues that came up was bias being imprinted into AI. And I think one of the big conversations in market research today is the increasing use of artificial intelligence in analyzing research, conducting research, helping to advise these strategies as well. Do you see a new issue brewing on the horizon when it comes to the use of technology and artificial intelligence, when we know there are these issues of AI repeating bias that it sees in society, of the data that is fed to an AI not being of sufficient quality, not taking diversity in different cultures into account? How do you see this developing over the coming years? Is there anything you've experienced, or yeah, what's your kind of view on this?
So I have two things. So AI is, as a Black and brown person, AI is
Yeah.
terrifying. It's
Hmm.
absolutely terrifying. They've started rolling out this type of technology for facial recognition work, specifically in police departments that have already kind of disproportionately targeted Black
Hmm.
and brown bodies. And there's already been cases where people have been misidentified
Yeah.
as criminals because of this technology, wholeheartedly believing this. There was no room for maybe the computer got it wrong. It was no, the computer identified you, so it must be
Yeah.
you, kind of a thing. Um, it's absolutely terrifying, and I think as humans, right, we are able to see distinctions within our own cultures more than people outside of our ethnicities. So, it's kind of the equivalent of being maybe one of two Black people in the office and always being called the other
Yeah.
person's name, because it feels like for that person, for whatever reason, they can't seem to separate the two of you, even though both of you could probably look
Yeah.
100% different. It's just the fact that you're
Hmm.
Black. So I feel like AI kind of, in things like facial recognition technology, kind of
Yeah.
mimics that, of not being able to understand the distinct differences as far as cheekbones, nose slants, all those things that I can
Hmm.
see in my people that other people have not taken the time to see in my people, if you will. And the same thing for South Asian
Hmm.
cultures or Korean. We group people together here, so Korean, Japanese, and Chinese in America looks the
Yeah.
same. But if you were to go to a Chinese community and ask them to point out someone who is Chinese versus Korean, they could probably do it a lot much more
Hmm.
easily than we could. It's an inherent bias in all of us. So that is an issue for sure. It's so funny. I was talking to a friend who's building a platform that's kind of based on psychology and all these other things. And I told her, this is great. This is a great platform, and do what you have to do. But I also told her I can already tell you that it's already wrong for
Yeah.
people of color. And what do you mean? And I said, she was like, it's just a psychology test. And I was like, I don't know what's wrong with it yet, but there's something it hasn't completely
Mm.
considered yet. That is relevant in our lives, that you haven't considered
Hmm.
for your platform. And it really took her aback, because this idea that what she's building that feels like it should be inclusive, it just felt wrong for her. But I told her I already know it's being built incorrectly. I don't know what it is
Hmm.
because I can't see it. But that's just kind of how
Yeah.
technology works. Like there's a purview and a perception that's not been included. So I think when we build things like this and have technology being developed, there needs to be an additional
Hmm.
lens of color in that, because there are things that we can bring to that picture once we see everything that non-POCs won't be able to see.
It's really interesting to hear your take on this, because one of the things that we discussed was this idea of we have a lot of discussions about AI ethics, and we have a lot of discussions about data quality. Maybe there needs to be more of a conversation about AI diversity or data diversity going forward, to ensure, as you mentioned, with these facial recognition systems or whatever else that it may be, to ensure that they truly recognize all races, all cultures, all differences, instead of being modeled on the dominant culture, the phrase I used before.
Yes. And listen, I understand that some industries just don't have a lot of
Hmm.
people of color in them, or if they do, maybe they're very overwhelmed and they can't, they can't do the additional work, or maybe they're locked into different companies. for industries where that is the case, I would advocate for brands to create some type of diversity commission of an outside network for people to sign NDAs and provide their perspectives of things that are being working on in
Yeah.
secret. People who understand the language of those industries, but can at least still give and pay them. Let's be clear, but can still give them an outside angle until they're able to, reach the appropriate diversity measures within their own ranks, which for some industries might take a little bit of time.
Now, I just want to change gears a little bit here. So I spent an inordinate amount of time, I have to say, digging through your website, Touch of Wit Creative, looking at a lot of the projects that you're working on. I really it's things that I've never really come across before. Any of the research space. So just some of the examples, things like racial bias in retail, decoding masculinity, a study of Black women's hair. So many just interesting projects that don't generally see the light of day. And I have to say, one of them that really caught my eye, as a big music lover, was decoding hip hop. And I'm really curious. What was this project about? What were you really looking into? And I think bringing up this cultural conversation that we had, hip hop is now the dominant culture. I think it's safe to say, especially when it comes to music terms. So, can you tell us just a bit more about the project and how do you think it reflects the culture that we're seeing around us now?
Yeah, this was a multi-step, multi-layered project, and I'll make sure not to divulge too much information here, but it was for a client that, it was for a client that's been actively in the hip hop space for years. And I think, as in most companies, when you kind of occupy an idea or a space for a long amount of time, and you have a changing of the guard, you have new joiners, you have new CMOs and everything. Sometimes the reasoning for those associations can get lost. And this client was kind of trying to understand the significance of hip hop today, and more specifically, how it might have changed over time, and what they could be doing to capitalize or to optimize in that space much more authentically and in a much more fresh way. And so the work was really built to create an internal kind of sociable understanding of the history of hip hop, how it's evolved over time, how where it sits today really connects with larger cultural shifts happening in culture today, and how that impacts the hip hop community, identifying the core tenets of hip hop, and more specifically talking about how it has become a part of the mainstream and should not be looked as a niche genre anymore. And so so it was just a lot of that first piece was a lot of foundational cultural context setting and saying, well, how did it get to where it is? Whether it's the fact that hip hop kind of grew up from what it started as, and the rappers themselves became educated. They got to know the system. They started kind of creating their own rules and dissolving the gatekeepers, if you will, of success in that space, which created different platforms for people looking to be successful. They learned how to become brands over time and what that means for their bottom line. And, technology has really enabled this kind of global sharing of hip hop. Which is why we see it in cultures all over the world. And even in the phase of work where I was to decode hip hop and brand messaging, figuring out the signifiers of hip hop, whether it be, hip hop style clothing, jewelry, vernacular, music in the background, if it was a commercial, sneakers or boom boxes, graffiti, DJs, things like that. It is everywhere. It's a part of everything. It was literally, I think it was one of the, in semiotics, we develop these codes when we look into things or concepts. And as I was looking at the hip hop, it was one of the largest code spreads I'd ever seen, because it's everywhere. It's in everything, even in products that you would think would not be associated with hip hop. And so, to your point, the conversation was that it is the mainstream, and because it's the mainstream, sometimes the meanings and the historicity of it has become diluted. And there's kind of this need to make sure to always celebrate the roots of hip hop and do it while also doing it in new, fresh ways.
I'm not sure if you've seen the series that came out, it's Hip Hop Evolution, a documentary series which really charts the kind of evolution of hip hop over the years. So going all the way back to New York and Grandmaster Flash, and then tracing it all the way through through to West Coast hip hop and the rise of like G-Funk and gangster rap, and all the way up to the modern day, but you have these huge stars, names like Kanye West and Drake, who are just household names, even for people who aren't hip hop fans.
Mhm.
One thing that always struck to me, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well, is the relationship between artists themselves and brands. So not necessarily brands using hip hop to sell a product, but almost artists selling a product by including it in their lyrics. So I think of really early examples, like Run DMC and My Adidas, or you have more recently you have artists like Migos and Versace, and this kind of brand name dropping almost that was a sign of braggadocio in hip hop. How do you see brands? Do they utilize that to their strengths? Are you seeing a changing messaging from these brands that maybe already appeal to the community before they realize that they even do?
That's a tricky question. You know, Adidas was a great starting
Hmm.
example of the power of hip hop and how that kind of grew and gained traction. I think from that, it kind of set a formulaic approach to for artists wanting to also
Yeah.
kind of cash in and talk about brands talk about the brands that
Hmm.
were relevant in their lives. I worked on a project, a luxury project, where the client realized that they were a part of this
Yeah.
glasses culture, if you will, in hip hop communities, and they were just like, we don't really know like how we got here or why
Yeah.
rappers really love us, but we don't really know what to do with that. So, in some ways, sometimes brands, if they feel that it is a significant part of their brand DNA and how they appear on screen and to their audiences, sometimes they will lean into that space, which is definitely true in the alcohol
Yeah.
and beverage consumption space for sure. Other brands who might not have come from that, maybe they just are fine with it being its own,
Hmm.
subculture, subgroup of people that love them, but maybe are not always so readily to create campaigns around that work. So it's a bit of a push pull. I think some artists are doing it for themselves and really kind of saying, I really love this, and with the
Hmm.
hopes of collaboration. Other artists are just kind of starting their own brands because they're tired of waiting for collaboration. And other brands are recognizing that they have traction in certain communities, but they don't really know what to do with it. They don't really know and sometimes it's a stereotyped lens, right? We're just that we're not that at
Yeah.
all, but you actually are. So, so yeah, it
And
just
just
depends.
one kind of final note on the hip hop project, because like I said, I could talk about this all day with you. I think, as you mentioned, hip hop has gone global. It's become democratized. The UK, where I'm from, we have grime, which is an offshoot of hip hop, which again I personally love. But you mentioned previously that there is this feeling of staying true to what these core principles are, what these kind of core values almost of the hip hop community are. And do you see that are brands trying to stick to those core values, or is there this willingness, from your experience, to embrace perhaps these newer offshoots that have emerged from hip hop, and where hip hop has also joined into other cultures of the genres as well?
Hip hop is a space. Usually, when I decode a topic or a category, there is an identification of like table stakes or things that are antiquated, meanings that are antiquated, expressions of that idea that that aren't fresh and aren't relevant. Hip hop is a space where everything that was old is 100% relevant. How it was built, what it came to be, and kind of how it exists today it has to
Hmm.
be built on that foundation. This has kind of created a division between old school hip hop
Yeah.
versus new school hip hop. Uh, which has sparked a lot of different debates with people who understood the roots of where hip hop came from and understood the grandmaster flashes and all these things, and they want
Hmm.
to always pay homage to that. But if we're being quite honest with ourselves, hip hop was never meant to
Yeah.
stay stagnant, and we've seen how even evolved in the United States and how there's different sounds in, say, a Miami
Hmm.
versus a West Coast, if you will, or even a Texas down south kind of vibe, or even how breaking was discovered, or finding the breaks in DJ records, etc. It was always meant to evolve. So, on one hand, there is a need for constant evolution, but there is also a need for
Mhm.
respecting the history of where it came from. And I think that this can be where brands kind of get it wrong, of not bringing in kind of the pioneers of that space, while maybe also having a nod to where it's kind of
Yeah,
evolved into, and not treating it like most people treat it as a decoration,
yeah.
a way to feel cool, if you will, without kind of,
Mhm.
giving props from where it's from. Erasing the historicity of an idea is something that brands do often, and in the space of hip hop, it can lead to inauthentic
And
portrayals
one
of
of the
the
things that
space for
I say
sure.
most when it comes to hip hop is I think a lot of the time, people just in it for the music, but you really need to listen to the lyrics because going back to what we were speaking of at the start about telling these stories from minority communities, telling these experiences. And I think of artists like Mos Def or Kendrick Lamar obviously comes to mind as an absolute master of his craft in this sense. When you listen to his music and he's putting forward these stories from his experience, from his upbringing, that obviously it's music that has this broad cultural appeal. Do you think, hip hop in particular, and other forms of black culture as well? Let's say you look at films by people like Spike Lee. Is this enough of a conduit, enough of a storytelling medium to really spread these stories? And why is it that to this day brands haven't managed to have that same kind of impact in terms of storytelling? We get much more of a real experience from things like this. And why is that some parts have been so slow to catch up to this idea?
Hip hop is a part of a voyeuristic trend that
Mm,
mainstream dominant culture has, of, oh my gosh, look at this
mm,
person's life. It's so different. I feel so fortunate to have this life of mine. And so when you have a genre like hip hop where the rawest voices are being shared and the rawest experience are being shared, and a medium that is also entertaining, then it
mm,
catches on in a different way. You have people who are outside of those communities who want to empathize with those spaces and feel like they can relate to some of the down periods in a person's story, if you will, even
yeah.
if they aren't black. And so that kind of voyeuristic, it's also the same as when you go into a different country and you're part of charity work and you're just like, oh my gosh, look at these brown
Yeah.
faces and they need my help. you know Americans love to be, and well, maybe not just Americans, but
Hmm.
people love to be perceived as heroes, and as being a part of something that maybe mainstream culture is unaware of. And I'm gonna advocate for these things. I'm gonna create change in this way. The reason hip hop gained such popularity, because it was one of the first really
Hmm.
popular ways of doing that, and the reason that brands kind of still fail in that space is because the leaders of those spaces are not
Yeah.
black and brown. They're not there to tell the stories, like a hip hop
Hmm.
orator might be. So I would probably also say that there is a need to, and I just want to also say, hip hop is not the space where all stories of blackness or black experiences or
Yeah, absolutely.
Latinx experiences should be told. That is one of many experiences, and it is not the only way
Hmm.
black people experience life. I think that Black culture as a whole, we're in this new space of being able to let go of the norms
Yeah.
that we were kind of brought up in. Many of us are brought up in the realm of needing to survive and be successful. But as acculturation and assimilation in the United States have become less necessary for success, we've kind of found a new pride in honoring where we've come from and honoring our heritage and our ethnicity in a much more loud and unapologetically Black way, also for Latinx cultures as well. So that's given us spaces to have more narratives told. It's given us space to have different forms of life pursued. I think you saw some of that where you see
Hmm.
athletes, for instance, getting degrees and having plan Bs, where in the past it was, I have to be a
Yeah.
football player and nothing else. I have to be a basketball player and nothing else. Where you see athletes saying, well, yeah, I'm going to retire at 30 or 28 and I'm going to, use this this engineering degree to do something else that
Hmm.
I'm also
Yeah.
well equipped at. So black space as a whole is having a lot of new experiences. Hip hop is one aspect of those
And
experiences
one
for
final note
sure.
on hip hop. I promise we're going after this. East Coast or West Coast?
I'm not. Listen, I'm an R&B. I'm an R&B lover, so I'm not one to give the right opinion here. But
Okay.
I love R&B for
No, it's
sure.
good. We'll skip past that one. I think it's fascinating to me when we speak about culture. We speak about music and culture, and one of the big conversations that's been going on over the past couple of months, what I've seen as well from my experience on social media, speaking to friends, is this idea of people trying to, educate themselves, people trying to find these stories, find these new perspectives that they previously hadn't listened to from Black and from other minority communities. From your perspective, is there anything, are there any kind of particular, books or movies or other kind of media that you would recommend, for those listening to this podcast who maybe are feeling in that same space? Are there any kind of ways that you'd recommend that you can really get a true understanding instead of something that is, as we've discussed, a lot through this conversation, that is more surface level?
That is a really good question. I know that there have been a lot of resources being put out. I don't know that I have an opinion on the best one or place to start. I would advocate, though, because it's probably the easiest to digest, to look at some of the things that Netflix has put together. And I would also advocate to look into things that are not always, how do I say this,
Yeah.
slave based, or like kind of telling those really hard stories, because again, that creates that dynamic of, oh my gosh, these poor people, they're so desolate. And, that's a part of our experience, things that happened in the past for sure, but there are plenty of us experiencing the world in different ways. And you need to also understand those issues as well. And so kind of looking at the happier ones, I'm thinking of this movie that I can't think of the title of. It's I think Spike Lee produced it. These young Black kids who are time travelers, and kind of trying to change. It's actually a very real story where one of the little boys, not very real, but in that one of the characters gets shot in a drive-by, and the time traveler basically tries to go back and change that. But you kind of see a different narrative there. You see some really smart children who are scientists who have kind of created their own device, and they figured out how to time hop, and it's like a really different dynamic way of telling the story. So I would advocate for just understanding the breadth of Black experiences in different ways. So yes, understanding the history for sure, but also recognizing other aspects of our identity for sure. And once you start in the Black space, make sure to understand Afro Latina or Latinx spaces as well, because that's a whole other layer. And to give yourself the space to do so. You can't do it in a day, can't even do it in a week. So it's going to take time to understand it, digest it, and really.
Absolutely. And speaking of different communities, different minority backgrounds, can you talk to us a bit about Insights in Color? So, how did Insights in Color start? And I see, as you mentioned, it is now coming back in force. I've seen some great posts recently from you as well. Can you just tell us a bit about Insights in Color? How does it work? And what's the aim of setting up this network?
Yeah, sure. So Insights in Color, I started during my time at Kantar Added Value. It was just more aimed at building community around the space in order for us to basically build a pipeline of recruitment for more diverse faces and voices. When I left Kantar, I didn't continue it. And as I started my own company, it was something that was very much on my mind and kind of came up in this pandemic era where we're kind of sitting around whittling our thumbs, if you will, and people are trying to affect change in other ways. This became a natural point to bring it back up. And so the goal of Insights in Color is it's many goals, but one, definitely to build community. We tend to be scattered across different agencies and within different brands. And so we need a central point of connection. So that's the first goal. Two, to build awareness. There's just a lack of understanding that this is a space for people to go into. And so there needs to be a telling of the story or in a sexier, more digestible way for younger audiences, so they can understand that this is a career they can pursue. And so they can stop having the narrative that I had, which is I just kind of found this and it's pretty awesome, And then three, I really want to change the industry. I want to change the narrative that research is built within. I want to change what's deemed as normative versus what's deemed as just actually this is reality. I want to change the way brands and agencies look at multicultural work as well, and really bring to life the tensions that we as researchers face in our space. We're in a weird predicament where we often feel responsible for the communities that we are telling stories about in our work, and tend to be the only voices in the room bringing up things that are incorrect, offensive, not accurate, or not representative as far as research is concerned, and trying to tell those stories. And even in multicultural work, I have to always try to create a lens of, well, why do I have to say that this is particularly important or different? Or why do, how do I do this in a way so they can empathize with these experiences? That is the common kind of role that I've had to play. And I want to basically shake it all up and have us start all over.
It's
and
no longer be the only voice in the room, but one of many who can really get that across.
Yes, it's going to be, my goal is to be quite more confrontational than PC.
It's the only way to get things done sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So we had a board meeting already for this work, and we're building the board of great senior leaders from across the world, actually. And so we'll be seeing more.
And I'd love to invite you as well to some of Esomar's community initiatives in future as well, because I think it's a great point that you're making. It's a great initiative, and it's a really important conversation that needs to be had. Of course, just kind of start to bring things to a close. There's a lot that we've covered in this conversation, going from the research sector to wider society as well. If you had a few words of advice, for the research sector, those who are listening from the sector, and also for young minority researchers who may today be in the position that you were in, 5 or 10 years ago, what advice would you give them moving forwards from this really, I think, frankly, quite historic, period in history?
Yeah. So for young researchers, I want to say you're not alone. I spent most of my career alone, and I fared well. But I want to say that there's a space for you now, for you to meet like-minded individuals, for you to commiserate and kind of have those conversations that you want to have that you can't always have in the workplace, and also a place where you can deal with some of the things that come up at your job with Insights in Color. And I just want to say, we see you, we hear you, and we're building a platform for you for sure. And for the brands, for the agency spaces, I just want to say, I think that there's a desire for change, and there's a desire for immediate change. And I think that there just has to be an acknowledgement that it's going to take a while to do it. And to do it correctly, there's a need to interrogate every step of the research process with a different lens, a different angle, a different perspective. And you need to challenge your clients. If I'm being quite honest, I've worked on many things where I just put the cultural lens in there. I'm just saying, well, I hear what you're saying, mainstream, but this community over here is really probably going to be the better one for you. Now, whether or not my clients listen to that, that's up to them. I'm not a part of their bottom line. But you're never going to hear feedback from me that doesn't include a multicultural, cultural lens as well. So I would advocate for brands and agencies to push beyond the data to talk about the larger cultural picture, which I find that clients really appreciate regardless. And to really bring those different perspectives into the work, even if not specifically asked for it.
Looking beyond the data and looking at society around us is exactly the mission statement of this podcast as well. And Whitney, thank you so much for joining us and for really sharing some really fascinating insights on, I think we'd agree, it's a really pivotal moment in history. And I do hope maybe some way, so a few months down the line, we'll have this conversation again, hopefully in a different, more optimistic context as well.
Yes,
and thank you, of course, to all of our listeners for joining us on this journey of discovery. Do make sure you check out Insights in Color as well. It is a great initiative, and I'm sure Whitney's going to have many updates in the near future. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Hopefully you've learned something new, and I do look forward to welcoming you on the show again next time. Now, if you enjoyed the show, please do follow us via Research World or on Spotify. And if you have any ideas for the show or any feedback, please contact us via podcast@esomar.org. Until next time, as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay curious. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.